Hey everyone, and welcome to week 11 of class. This week we are going to dive into really two major movements or developments that took place within the United States as well as elsewhere. And the first of these movements is one that really began, to a degree, began during the 18th century, in the latter part of the 1700s. It began to gain some momentum in the early 19th century, and then it would continue to develop and boom in the latter part of the 19th century, and continued on in some respects well into the 20th century. And the movement that we're going to be talking about is the Industrial Revolution. And in many ways, this revolution began in the United States a little bit later than it did in other countries, specifically in England. But this Industrial Revolution is a timeline, it's a process that took place where you began to see, albeit slowly at first, then it gains momentum, where you begin to see the development of industrialization. And much of that industrialization is going to take place in the North. And I will say this, although Southerners did not necessarily invest much time in the development of industry in the South, the two economies, whether it was the slave economy or the industrializing Northern economy, they were connected. So for example, obviously Southern economies based upon slave labor were growing a number of commodities, but specifically cotton. And in fact, during the 19th century, cotton becomes what they call king cotton. Many of the northern factories, which were textile factories, relied upon southern cotton. And so there was a connection between these two economies, but you're going to begin to see this development of industry. And so we're going to talk about that this week. And look at some of the early modes of industrial development, largely with respects to transportation and the early movements with respect to things like the railroad and canals and what have you. But we're also going to be taking a look at what we call antebellum reform movements. And during the 19th century, starting, I would say, in the 1820s, going on forward from there, you see a number of movements to try and reform American society. Many of these reform movements are spurred on and encouraged by the Industrial Revolution, the change in the economic and market system that's going on. But there's also a religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening that's really inspiring many people to look at social problems and issues and try to reform them. And so you'll begin to see prison reforms and the development of asylums. You'll begin to see movements towards reforming education. There are a number of utopian communities, the Oneida community, among others, that will spring up. But you also see some very large movements, such as abolition and the women's rights movement and temperance. And it's those three movements that we are going to look at this week in more detail. And the way that we're going to do that is through a number of different venues, one of which will be an online reading. And if you go into this week's reading assignment, you'll see where I've broken down for you what sections of the online content I want you to look at. And you're going to need that for the discussion board. But there's also a couple of Khan Academy videos on the temperance movement. And the temperance movement is something that developed as a means to try and temper the ingestion of alcohol. It will eventually, later on in the 20th century, culminate in the passage of the Prohibition Act. But right now, we're just going to focus on this early temperance movement. And there are a number of causes for it and what have you. So that's really what we're looking at this week. And so I hope you will enjoy it. And as always, you do have a discussion board this week. Your initial post will need to be up by Thursday by 11:59 p.m. And then, of course, your subsequent response to another student will be due by Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And if you have any questions, as always, please feel free to contact me. Otherwise, I will leave you as I always do. Go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.